Hi, I'm Lieutenant Colonel Shanna Cronin, and along with Captain Aaron Heinz, we're going to go over some of the transfers that are available to victims through the United States Army. We're going to cover some of the transfers that are both for sexual assault victims as well as some domestic violence. The views expressed in this are personal views of some of the policies, and they're not to be annotated as from the Department of Defense. Some of the things that we're going to cover today is the different types of transfers, some of the jargon that you may want to know, some of the eligibility requirements, but also some of the step-by-step what you should need victims to do. Also kind of understanding some of the background that could complicate things in different types of transfers. So first thing we'll cover, Captain Heinz will cover, is the expedited transfers.
All right, hello, my name is Captain Aaron Heinz. We're going to jump right in discussing expedited transfers today. Expedited transfers are a type of transfer for victims of certain crimes. It allows them to transfer either to another unit within the same installation or to completely different installation in the United States Army. It used to be that these transfers were only available for service member victims. However, recently there was a change, so now adult dependents of service members can qualify if they are victims of sexual offenses. And on the next slide, we'll talk about the sexual offenses that qualify. But before we get that, a few other things I want to discuss on that slide. In order to qualify for an expedited transfer, a certain type of formal report needs to be made, and that type of report is called an unrestricted report of sexual assault. What it means to be unrestricted is just that the command and also law enforcement is aware of the report of a sexual assault. Because victims have the option to file a restricted report, meaning the command and law enforcement will not become aware of the report of a sexual assault. Only unrestricted victims can get an expedited transfer because the command is the approving authority for an expedited transfer. So the command has to be aware of the reported crime in order to make that decision about an expedited transfer. And ma'am, I'll hand it over to you if you have any additions.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to note on this, and when you talk unrestricted or restricted, is kind of give an example. An unrestricted report is what triggers the ability to have an expedited transfer, although it doesn't mean that the report couldn't have been restricted previously. In my prior experience as a special victim prosecutor, we had a soldier who filed a restricted report. She was entitled to a lot of other services such as special victim counsel and health care, but there was no official investigation going on, and command did not even know that she had been sexually assaulted. About 9 months later, she decided to make that restricted report unrestricted, which she has the right to do. And when she did that and people found out about it, she made the decision that she didn't really want people, I think she felt there were people talking about her, and she wanted to take advantage of that expedited transfer. She was able to have an expedited transfer even 9 months later because when it became unrestricted. So the thing to note is not only that it has to be unrestricted, but a prior restricted report doesn't prevent it. And also there's no time limit. Although it's called expedited because it's tried to be done very quickly for the victim doesn't have to make this in an expedited manner. It doesn't mean they have to request this right after the sexual assault, but they have to, once it's unrestricted, they can request it at any time, whether that's 9 months, 6 months, a year later.
Absolutely. And as Colonel Cronin mentioned, this can be requested at any time during the process. So even in a case where, say, the reported sexual assault goes to a court-martial and results in an acquittal, the victim could still request an expedited transfer at that time as well. In order to request an expedited transfer, currently it only applies to a few specific offenses under the UCMJ. 117A is one of the offenses, and that's wrongful broadcast or distribution of intimate visual images. Commonly, people think of that as revenge porn or someone, distributing photos that are intimate without your consent on Facebook or otherwise. That would be an example of a 117 alpha. Article 120 captures our rape and our sexual assault offenses under the UCMJ, the Uniform Code of Military Justice. And so victims who are reporting those offenses can qualify for an expedited transfer as well. And then finally, Article 120 Charlie, which is indecent viewing, visual recording, or broadcasting of private area images of a person without their consent. So again, an example of that would be if someone recorded you during sexual intercourse without your knowledge or consent, that would be an example of a 120 Charlie. And then finally, 130, which is stalking under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. So those four types of offenses are the types of offenses that currently qualify for expedited transfer requests. Now, with that being said, there is some movement currently to expand the scope of expedited transfers so that potentially domestic violence victims can qualify. But right now, that is not the current state of the law, although we think in the future it may shift towards that direction. But there are other transfers that we will talk about that domestic violence victims can qualify for. So we will table that for our next slide. And the last thing I want to mention on this slide is dependent victims can now also request expedited transfers, and that has to be done through the service member who the victim dependent is a dependent for. And this is a new change, so this isn't actually something that I have seen personally in my experience. I don't know if Colonel Cronin has, but essentially the one requirement would be that the service member is not the perpetrator. And so that could foreclose, certain situations, but again, there are other options for that dependent potentially.
And Captain Heinz, I saw something similar to this where it actually is why this is a great change in the law. One of the cases I had while as an SVP was where we had a spouse of a service member who was sexually assaulted by another member of the unit at a unit party. And she wanted to transfer, her husband wanted to transfer, but because she was the dependent, that wasn't available. We went through different for them to try to go with a compassionate reassignment. And ultimately that's what they did, although it took a lot longer because of the fact that there was trying to show why he should be transferred when it was her that was the victim. The new change in the law would have been able to allow that to happen in a lot quicker of a manner, because as we'll cover some of the things with expedited transfers is that commanders have to act on these within 5 days of when they're requested. And so that was one that it would have been great to have back then, but that my experience was from a few years ago before this change in the law.
And so the way that the victim can request an expedited transfer is by filling out this DA form. It's called the DA form 4187. Now, any victim advocates or sexual assault response coordinator will have those forms readily available for you to fill out. So that is how you would do that, is you would go to a SARC or a VA and you would fill out the form, which would then be routed to the commander, who is the approving authority. Now, one of the changes recently to the law was that the command now has to act on these requests within 5 days. And so that should hopefully expedite this expedited transfer process. And the other change in the law too is there is a strong presumption in favor of approving expedited transfer request, as long as the report is a credible report. And that's a standard. It's a small or low standard, if you will. It's essentially the commander deciding, do we have a reasonable belief that a crime occurred? It's a low standard in the legal system, and they are supposed to consult with judge advocates or attorneys in the military, like Colonel Cronin and myself, to ensure that they are following the law. But there is a strong presumption in favor of approving these requests so that victims can feel safe and secure in the workplace and where they live on post, if they live there. One of the other new changes is your new command, they won't find out about your report of sexual assault or your request for an expedited transfer, except if there is an ongoing court-martial or other disposition of the case, or if you are continuing to receive services such as medical services or SARC or VA services at your new installation, your command would only be tracking it to the extent that you're receiving those services. So they're not going to be told details about your sexual assault report or your case or anything like that. It's simply to make sure that you are receiving the care that you need in order to take care of yourself and hopefully heal from the trauma that you have experienced.
One thing to note is that when you're talking about the commander has to act in 5 days, that doesn't mean that you will move in 5 days. It means that the commander approves the request or denies the request, and there is an appellate process if the request is denied. But if it's approved, then orders are still cut and you still have to PCS. So just as a kind of warning to any clients or victims, that this isn't something that you're going to be out of the unit within that week. It is going to take a little bit of time for orders to be cut so that if you have household goods to be moved, things of that nature, but it is sped up as opposed to the typical PCS cycle. Another type of transfer that we'll cover on the next slide is compassionate reassignments. Compassionate reassignments also can be called safety transfers. These are handled more by FAP than through the command. The difference is sometimes these can be very, very fast, and sometimes these are actually a lot longer than expedited transfers, and it's really fact dependent. So these could be used as a way, as a safety transfer to get someone out of a situation. And I've seen ones where they are immediately transferring them without household goods, literally within 24 hours, but they are out. The idea is to get them out of the area out of fear for their life. They then have to sometimes have a power of attorney come back and do all their moving. There are other ones that I've seen that are compassionate reassignments that have taken a while to get processed through FAP because of the fact that they need to be able to show why this move is necessary. One of the differences of this is that this does not require a compassionate reassignment or safety transfer. Does not require one of those 4 types of crimes. It's not just sexual assault. They could be used for stalking. It also can be used for domestic violence or other types of threat of harm. Compassionate reassignments are also very broad. It could be even used for things such as you are the only child and your parents are going through chemo and they need help, and so you're asking for compassionate reassignment to be moved closer to family to provide that care. So there's a wide variety of compassionate reassignments. What we're talking about today is typically in the realm of SV or DV, and so that's where we've seen that. One of the examples that I would give as far as compassionate reassignments is that I had a case where the husband and the wife were both active duty military. She wanted to get a compassionate reassignment because there was evidence that had come forward that he had been abusing their children. And at first she had a hard time accepting that fact because he had not been abusive towards her. But as she started to see the medical evidence, she started to have fear for her own safety. And she wanted a compassionate reassignment to be able to get to a different duty location than him. Because they were dual military, she was enrolled in what's called the Married Army Couples Program, or MACP. A compassionate reassignment or safety transfer cannot happen unless you are disenrolled from that program, because the Army tries to keep married couples together. So the first thing she had to do before she could even ask for the compassionate reassignment was go to her S1 and disenroll from the Married Army Couples Program, which is a different type of 4187. After she did that, she could put in the paperwork for a compassionate reassignment to be transferred to a different location than where her husband was. She did get that transfer, and then ultimately was able, once there, to file for divorce and feel safe both for herself and for her children. We're going to go over some of the differences, and some of this Captain Heinz and I have already incorporated as to how we explain the 2 transfers, but this slide really highlights some of the differences between them. As far as some of them only involve sexual assault, but to note, it does not include sexual harassment. So Captain Heinz covered the crimes, and recently there was a new executive order signed by the president that sexual harassment is a separate offense under Article 134. Although sexual harassment is a separate offense, it is not covered by expedited transfers. A person who was sexually harassed could apply for a compassionate reassignment at this point, but it is not considered one of the criteria for expedited transfers. Same with domestic violence. compassionate reassignments or safety transfers would be available, but expedited transfers would not. Captain Heinz, is there anything else you wanted to expand or some examples from your experience?
The only example that I think would be helpful is with respect to timing. One of the things that Colonel Cronin discussed is that a compassionate reassignment, when it's a safety move, i.e. the victim has concerns about their safety eminently, can sometimes be faster than an expedited transfer. So I have seen a victim of domestic violence who reported the domestic violence to CID, and CID became involved. And then after that, her service member perpetrator continued to stalk her around base and visit her on-post home. And so she began to fear for her safety. So she applied for a safety move through the family advocacy program. They were able to get her out of there within 48 hours. So it was very fast. And again, that would just be through family advocacy. That would be the process. But it's not always necessarily very fast. It does depend on the facts and the circumstances of your case and whether you are in imminent fear of your life or your children's lives. That would make it a faster process.
One of the things that Captain Heinz already hit on was this change in the law, and I talked a little bit about how I think this is a great change because it allows adult dependents, such as spouses, to be able to get that expedited transfer both for themselves and for their service member spouse. The main criteria of this is that this would not apply if the perpetrator was the service member spouse. So in cases of domestic violence or of spousal rape, the Army is not going to expedite transfer the dependent and keep the service member in one spot. This would be when the perpetrator of the offense is from outside that family unit. They're still moving the family unit as a whole. If they are dual military, or if the non-military spouse wants to move, the non-military spouse always has the ability to move away from where their service member is assigned, but family advocacy could help them with what resources are available to do that. Some of the last considerations is, besides what transfers are available, if the victim reaches out to their special victim counsel or to the special victim witness liaison, they may know of some civilian resources in the area. This could be from anything from short-term resources while the transfer is pending. I've had a case where the SVC helped the service member get a new apartment because the perpetrator lived in the same apartment complex, and she didn't want the expedited transfer at that point. At that point, it was still the restricted report, and she wanted to be able to feel safe in her own home. And so the SVC helped with terminating a lease and getting a new apartment. So there are some those types of resources, both in the military and some civilian, especially for domestic violence, as far as how to help them get out of the situation quickly while we can process these types of requests. There are sometimes complications with joint bases by who's the approval authority. And Captain Heinz, do you want to cover some of that, since I know you were at a joint base previously?
Yes, I think it just becomes more difficult when, depending on if the victim is a service member in the Navy or in the Army, there's different processes depending on which service the victim is in. And so I would just say, continue to consult with your FAP and your VAs. And if you have a special victim counsel, they can also be very helpful in those situations.
We already touched a little bit on the dual military aspect as far as a compassionate reassignment, and whether for expedited transfer because it was a dual military, or if it was domestic violence and compassionate reassignment. Either one, the military member would have to disenroll from married unmarried couple program to be able to be eligible for either type of transfer. The other thing that we're wanting to highlight is that even though you may be able to get those transfers, that doesn't mean that that's the only thing we can do. So in the immediate, victims should be asking for a military protective order that can include communication, digital, so that even if in the short term until they move, they're not being contacted by the perpetrator, but then long term, after they've moved, they're not having to worry about every time their phone rings that it's somebody trying to connect to them regarding that. Lastly, no matter what type of transfer, none of these transfers are available unless it's unrestricted. And that's because of the fact that if it's a restricted report, there's no official law enforcement investigation, and we need that official law enforcement investigation and command's involvement or no knowledge to be able to make either of these transfers happen. Captain Heinz, is there anything else you wanted to cover?
No, ma'am.
Right. Well, thank you everyone for tuning in, and hopefully this helps distinguish. I know there's other briefs by some of the other services, and so how different services do things maybe a little bit different. But to understand, for any Army victims, these are the different routes that you could go to try to help prevent, help them feel protected and safe. Thank you so much.
Thank you.